Quick but important disclaimer on this episode. The hosts of Ways We Learn are not doctors, and the opinions discussed here are not medical advice. If you're interested in trying any of the prescription drugs or supplements discussed in this episode, we suggest you consult a physician. And now, on with the show.
I need some type of help to succeed in this environment. For me personally, I found that help with nootropics. And nootropics gives me the ability to directly impact the levels of neurotransmitters, primarily dopamine and norepinephrine in the trillion synapses in my brain. And that, alongside behavioral interventions, which for me is everything from meditation, ice baths, workout routine, eating healthy, things like that, have created this kind of flywheel where I'm constantly getting better at what I do.
Hey, you found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something. Hi, and welcome back to Ways We Learn. I'm Sean, and I'm here with Joe and Brian. So much of what we focus on in education involves improving the brain's unassisted functioning and skill. Focus, motivation, understanding. Basically, how well can a person think and how much can they improve that thinking? But there are natural and artificial substances that can also modulate and improve your brain chemistry and function. How many of us have drunk a cup of coffee as a stimulant first thing in the morning? Or maybe more importantly, as an afternoon pick-me-up? And how many of us have experience or knowledge of ADHD drugs like Ritalin and Adderall and how they make it more possible for people with that condition to focus and succeed? In this episode, we'll be talking about the world of nootropics, the spectrum of substances from natural to fully synthetic that are meant to improve cognitive function. And we have an expert on nootropics with us today. Dan Fried is the founder and CEO of Thesis, which offers cognitive performance products formulated to improve focus, energy, memory, mood, confidence, and motivation. After struggling to focus throughout his childhood and dropping out of high school, Dan worked his way up the ranks of the restaurant industry, achieving saucier in a 3-star Michelin restaurant. Facing burnout after a decade in hospitality, he resolved to go back to school, a dream he says he realized through his discovery of cognitive performance supplements, which changed his mental function and, in turn, transformed his life. After graduating from master's programs at Yale and INSEAD, Dan launched Thesis to help others optimize their brain function and unlock their full potential. Dan, welcome to Ways We Learn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I think of you as a proponent of better living through chemistry. And one of the main things that I'm kind of curious about diving into just right out of the gate is Adderall. Like, two of the most popular, I think, nootropic drugs, if you want to use the broad range of that category, would probably be Adderall and caffeine. So just to start, how much Adderall is flowing through the United States right now?
2021, which was the last year that we have reliable data, there was 41 million individual prescriptions. This morning, tens of millions of people woke up and took a prescription stimulant. So there's a lot of different ways to track it, from the DEA quotas that say how much amphetamines can be produced in the US. What is very clear is it's this exponential curve that in this version of the stimulant epidemic, it started in the late 80s and it's just going one direction. It's up and to the right, and more ADHD diagnoses are coming across, and more Adderall and similar prescriptions are coming through.
Do you have any sense of like the gross tonnage of how much Adderall came through the U.S. in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, so they have quotas. I don't remember the exact year, but I believe this year we're at about 100,000 pounds. And we're dealing with an Adderall shortage. So that encompasses all amphetamine and amphetamine-like substances, including methylphenidate. Quotas will range between 100 and 150, depending on how you calculate it, pounds per year.
Is the quota like about international drugs being imported or just total in the US? Like, how does that quota system work? Who sets it? Why does it exist?
It's the federal government. And this is really important now because there's an Adderall shortage, which, I mean, that's a whole nother thing to dive into because they think that it's going to have a huge impact on public health and education. So there are children that need Adderall to function and what happens when they're not able to get their medication. But the quota, I believe, is from the DEA. And they basically say how much of any scheduled narcotic is approved to be produced in the US. And then they distribute the production across different manufacturers. But every controlled substance has a quota.
Got it.
Got it. So right now in 2021 there was 41 million prescriptions for Adderall in the U.S., which is a little over 10% of the population, or around 10%, I think.
No, so those are individual prescriptions. People will have multiple prescriptions throughout the year.
Got it.
Again, the data, it's really difficult to get, like, you have to kind of triangulate between a couple of different sources. My best estimate is more than 20 million people every day take a prescription stimulant in the US.
Got it.
Do you have any sense of how much of that is students and like young kids? Like where's the drug mostly flowing to? Is it mostly flowing to young people trying to pass their tests, or young kids who can't sit in the chair, or is it adults? Is it just everywhere? There's no way to know.
So there are ways to know, but again, it's difficult you have to kind of like triangulate information. So the fastest growing demographic is adult ADHD. So these are people 25 plus who have been recently diagnosed, not as a child. If you look at statistics in college, Adderall is the most widely abused prescription medication in the US, period. Like it, beyond opioids, beyond anything else. It is the second most used drug in the college age demographic, behind marijuana. And when you look at getting into children, there's different statistics on the percentage of the population under 18 that's being prescribed Adderall. Any way you look at it, it's significant, somewhere, single digit percentages, but mid single digits. Let me back up and tell you just a little bit about my story.
Sure.
I have severe ADHD. I was actually expelled from preschool at 4 years old. I don't
Seems extreme.
remember.
Wow.
Yeah, at 6, my elementary school mandated that I see a psychiatrist, and I was formally diagnosed with ADHD. They had wanted to put me on methylphenidate, Ritalin. This was like the late 80s. So I have a deep experience of what it's like, both to be prescribed stimulants, to be untreated, to have it as a child in a classroom, to have it as an adult. And now that I'm older, I have friends with children that have ADHD. And because I work in this industry, a lot of people will come to me and say, hey, the doctor wants to prescribe my child. And it's an interesting perspective. I do think that the type of behavior that I was exhibiting as a young child was unusual, even for kind of like that time period. Even for now, it would be unusual. And I think Adderall is a highly effective medication and should be used in children. The problem that I see is a lot of the prescriber behavior for a medication like this. One, it's a Schedule II narcotic. It should not be a first line of defense. Right now, there are very few options as a first line of defense. Mm-hmm. So if you look at an adjacent category, look at, pain. If I sprain my wrist and I go to the doctor, they're going to give me aspirin. And if the pain's really acute, they'll think hard before they escalate me to a weak opioid. If you take a child to the doctor and you say, hey, this kid's having trouble focusing, they have one tool, and it's a prescription amphetamine. And, I strongly believe that there should be other options before escalating to something that powerful.
So let's dig in there. Let's say, one of us has a kid, and and that kid has severe ADHD. What are the other possible options of how you might go about solving that problem or thinking that through?
So there's a lot of behavioral interventions, everything from therapy. Therapy is actually highly effective. There is a game approved by the FDA. Um, it's called Akili, and it actually has clinical evidence that if you get your child to routinely engage with this progressively difficult game, it can increase their attention span. Um, there's a lot of behavioral interventions around, making sure the kid has adequate nutrition, sleep. One of the key things that I think is driving some of this attention epidemic is just the availability of electronic devices and social media and how that's changing children's brains as they develop. But those are some of the main behavioral interventions that have been proven to work.
Gotcha. And then, so let's say you're an adult and you're having trouble focusing and you're saying, hey, I don't really want to take Adderall I think a Schedule II narcotic might be a little too heavy for me. What are we actually trying to solve here with an attention deficit disorder? And then, like, what are some other options that are available for an adult? Like if you wanted to take a chemical route.
So yeah, let me back up and tell you first my personal experience, and then I'll tell you kind of like how I see that working broadly. So, to fast forward my story, I ended up not being treated for my ADHD in school growing up. And at 16, I ended up dropping out of high school. I went on to find a career as a chef where I was super successful. And it's the type of focus needed in the culinary industry is very different from what you need in the structured environment of the American educational system. So this was a really eye-opening experience where I went from, being called stupid and lazy in a classroom and not understanding why it was so difficult for me to adapt to that environment, whereas other people could just do so easily. Like for me, doing homework was this monumental task that I just couldn't do. And my sister was able to come home and sit down and do it. So once I experienced what it was like to be successful in a career as a chef, I kind of understood more that my mind worked differently, not necessarily better or worse, but highly dependent on the type of environment and situation I was put in. Now, adapting to, most of my day I spend at a desk in front of a computer. This is where it's difficult for me. I need some type of help to succeed in this environment. For me personally, I found that help with nootropics. And nootropics gives me the ability to directly impact the levels of neurotransmitters, primarily dopamine and norepinephrine in the trillion synapses in my brain. And that alongside behavioral interventions, which for me is everything from meditation, ice baths, workout routine, eating healthy, things like that, have created this kind of flywheel where I'm constantly getting better at what I do, and I no longer struggle. I'm able to function in my role today, which is essentially sitting at a desk all day. And I don't think that would be possible without both of those. So some type of pharmacological intervention, which for me is nootropics, and behavioral intervention.
So what is actually in it? What are actually nootropics? Because it's not just one thing. It's not just a pill like Adderall. It's a series of compounds that have different effects, and you can take them in different weights and measures, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I define nootropic is a very broad definition. Not everyone agrees with this, but it's any ingredient that modulates the levels of neurotransmitters in your brain.
Right. So caffeine and coffee would be a nootropic.
So would Adderall.
Yeah.
Adderall's a prescription medication, but I do look at it as also a nootropic.
So nootropic you view as a pretty broad umbrella term with no?
A psychoactive drug that can improve performance. If you want to kind of
Oh, interesting. So nootropic is inherently positive. It's about improving performance, not necessarily just changing.
I was wondering that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And a drug is also, broadly speaking, drug is a category created by the FDA. Everybody thinks, there's prescription, over-the-counter drugs, but drug is, anything that impacts the body. Under that, nootropics, I think you have prescription medications like Adderall, which will greatly increase the levels of dopamine and norepinephrine through several mechanisms of action. So they're reuptake inhibitors. They actually have more of those neurotransmitters dumped into the synapse. There's several different ways that they impact that. Nootropics can impact the same neurotransmitter systems, but they do it through different mechanisms of action, or through the same but in a weaker action. So the good thing about that is they also have, at least for me, they have a lot fewer side effects. So I've taken just about every prescription stimulant out there. I'm somebody that if I went to a physician, they would recommend that I be on stimulants. They work, so they are highly effective at treating my ADHD. However, the side effects outweigh the benefits. So I like to joke that Adderall should come with a warning label, may cause you to become an I'm highly productive. I'm also a miserable human being, and I just can't tolerate that.
So the side effects are behavioral. Is that the idea mostly? Like, I guess, like, what are the negative side effects for the more intense additions?
So there's, everything from anhedonia, which is you don't get pleasure out of the same activities, to there's the ones that are most common in our customers and the people we work with are jitters, crash, trouble sleeping. There's also loss of appetite. For me, it was anger and irritability. I would just, at the end of the day, I didn't want to be around people. If I had to wait in a line, I would have like a mini meltdown, like a 3-year-old tantrum. Not like physically, but like in my mind, I'm just like complete loss of patience. And the whole thing, one of the things that I noticed when I transitioned was I thought that I was more productive. But when I looked at what I was actually producing, it wasn't more. So it's almost like the tortoise and the hare, like going back and forth. I'd be highly productive and super focused, but then either I would focus on something that wasn't what I should be working on, or I would crash and like it just wasn't sustainable. I wouldn't sleep well. So the next day I felt like crap, and my actual output wasn't increasing, even though it felt like it was.
Is that a byproduct of dopamine? Because that sounds like the effect of that a lot of people find of multitasking, where you feel very productive, but you're not really getting anything accomplished. And the feeling of productivity comes from the dopamine hit that you get from those activities. Is that related to what you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, the dopamine crash is what I feel when the medication's wearing off. That is primary. And you also, if you use stimulants regularly, you can desensitize some of the dopamine receptors, and your body has this incredible mechanism of homeostasis where it starts recalibrating to these elevated levels
of
dopamine or epinephrine
or more. Yeah.
Exactly. One of the primary causes of anhedonia is you're just used to having your synapses flooded with dopamine, so you get recalibrated, and things that used to give you a dopamine boost, it's just not as strong, and you're not responding in the same way.
What's that last word you just said?
Anhedonia. It's a fancy medical term that basically means what used to give you joy no longer gives you joy. So like what gave you dopamine before, you're no longer, and it's basically a form of depression.
Oh, it's like a much more serious version of being jaded. Like a very chemical edition.
Chemical version of jaded. So the effect that you're describing, you said that you have severe ADHD. I know that some people use these stimulants or nootropics who don't necessarily need them. Do they have the same kind of effect when they wear off for them?
There's different ways to look at this, and this is a very there's a lot of people that have strong opinions on this. I would say that Adderall works the same way, where it increases levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in everybody's brain. It depends on what dose, how you use it, I think that most of the clinical research is done at a very responsible dose. And so you're not going to have this same crash in everyone. But yeah, I mean, the human brain, that's what those drugs do. I think that there's also interesting research on stimulants and productivity in people who don't have ADHD. So one really interesting piece of information is the Yerkes-Dodson law that basically says, depending on the complex, like as you increase your level of arousal by taking stimulants, you increase your productivity up to a point, at which point it's actually counterproductive because you're hyper aroused. And it's also different for different tasks. So if you're doing a simple task where there's no real like complex problem solving or creativity, that changes where you're going to be on that curve. So like more stimulants will make you more productive depending on the task. Whereas if you're doing complex problem solving or a creative task where you need a different type of focus, it actually makes you less productive much earlier on.
What a pain. That's the worst. What
Yeah.
So then if Adderall isn't, Adderall and its friends, isn't the long-term solution, and it sounds like it's a sledgehammer, right? It's a sledgehammer on the problem. It works, but it has some collateral damage. You found a combination of, I think, the behavioral stuff, which is always really interesting because anytime you can fix something without meds seems like a great one. And then the other one of just, I think, nootropics, I'm saying it right. How did you discover nootropics and kind of like go along that journey? How did you make that transition away from kind of traditional Adderall over to it?
So it wasn't a one-to-one transition. It was, I had used the Adderall and different stimulants off and on, and I came to the conclusion that I told you previously.
Yeah.
And, in my late 20s, I was transitioning from being a chef. So I had reached, the top of my career as a chef, and I was no longer cooking for the most part. A lot of my job was people management. I was working on board a cruise ship, so it was also brutal
Ooh.
hours, 6 months of work without a day off. And I started to burn out, and I wanted to do something different. But I had no high school diploma, never went to college, I never even took the SAT, no high level like math or any of those things. And I somehow got it into my head that I wanted to get an MBA. And this was about 10 years ago now, a little bit more. And so I started studying for the GMAT, which was a very crazy goal. And I just got a study guide and sat down and started studying.
There you go.
And it felt like I was back in 10th grade. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't sit still through a practice test. I couldn't internalize information. And I wanted this more than anything in my life. And I was desperate. So I tried anything I could think of, from, different dieting routines, keto and ice baths and meditation and anything that I thought could help improve my focus. And I had heard about nootropics on a study forum. So I immediately went out and I bought everything that I could find. And I would take different ingredients and study. And this was like a really short feedback loop because I could tell I'm taking something and what's my output? How do I feel? It was subjective performance, but it was pretty clear when something was working and when something wasn't. That feedback loop was really important. And most ingredients did nothing, but a couple of them worked. And when I figured out how to combine them into a winning formula, the results were life-changing. So when I went in to take the GMAT, I ended up scoring in the 99th percentile, which, surprised the hell out of me. It got me into INSEAD and Yale for 2 master's degrees. And this is, framing that problem. I am just as intelligent now as I was when I failed out of high school. What changed was the levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, my ability to focus. And those are solvable problems.
Yeah. So what were the compounds that you were using? And then what does thesis carry right now?
So I get asked that question all the time. The question that people should be asking is which nootropics work for me, and everybody's different. What we do at Thesis is we basically take that process that I used to find my formula, which took 6 months, thousands of dollars, and countless hours of searching the internet, and we compress that down to a process that users can go through and discover their formula in less than a month for less than $100, and we walk them through that process. It first starts with a quiz. They tell us about themselves, their goals, and then we narrow down which ingredients they should start with, because ADHD is primarily a disorder of dopamine and norepinephrine, as well as some other things. But some people should be optimizing their serotonin and GABA, or their acetylcholine, BDNF. There's a lot of different goals that people have. For example, this is what I took before this podcast. When I'm going to get into deep conversations, this optimizes for verbal fluency. It makes me more pro-social. It has ingredients targeted to serotonin and GABA. So, every once in a while, I still have a little bit of performance anxiety when I do public speaking. This helps to make that smoother.
For anybody listening on the audio edition, he held up a box that says confidence on it.
And then, does it work that quickly?
Yes and no. So some ingredients are like caffeine, that's just as an example. They are, you'll notice results the same day you take it.
Yeah.
Some of them take a while to notice. In here, it has Hinokio, which immediately increases GABA, which is a modulator. It basically is anti-anxiety and makes things like this much easier for me. It also has longer acting ingredients like Zembrin, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor that you can notice benefits in the same day, but if you use it regularly, the benefits get even more impactful.
So, okay, that's interesting, because you just mentioned an SSRI, which can be done through prescription medication, but are your ingredients natural? Are they on the, I don't know how to term it, but like on the drug side? This is not by prescription, right? Anybody can go in here and buy it, meaning this has to be all, at least not FDA regulated materials.
Yes, they're supplements. And
So supplements.
there are supplements that are SSRIs. I think that, again, this is where the way that they do drugs and determine like what schedule it is, all of that stuff, is a regulatory framework. So there are many things. Here's an example. L-Dopa is a drug for Parkinson's that impacts dopamine. It's also from plant, and you can buy it as a supplement. It's just how it's refined and how it's processed. But it's essentially the same thing. And there are things that are both supplements and drugs, or at least like very, very close. But this confidence will not be this. Even though it has the same mechanism of action, it's very different from what you would find in a prescription SSRI.
Right. And so, for somebody who's looking at your site and looking at the ingredients here, these are not, we're not talking about homeopathic medicine. We're not talking about prescription medicine. These are like herbal supplements. Is that the idea behind, or a lot of them are?
In the ADHD space, essentially, almost all of the medications are doing the same thing. So by far, stimulant medications are what are prescribed for ADHD. You have some non-stimulant medications, but they're not quite as effective, and they're nowhere near like the levels of prescription as stimulants. You have Ritalin, methylphenidate, which came out in the 80s or became popular in the 80s. And then you have Adderall, which is a mix of amphetamine salts. Each one of these medications is patented, which gives a pharmaceutical company, like, they start marketing to doctors, and they it funds their ability to conduct clinicals, and it gives them an upside to the IP that they've created. But this creates a very unique incentive structure where you have, Ritalin, and then you have Adderall, and then you have Concerta, which is also methylphenidate. It just has a really novel time release mechanism to kind of change the pharmacokinetics, how much of it is in your bloodstream, and how that impacts everything from absorption, time release, all of that. And then you have Vyvanse, and each one of these innovations primarily is done so that pharma can make more money. And that's really, it's prevalent across the pharmaceutical industry. I don't believe that everybody in pharma is evil. It's just under that incentive structure that creates a very specific type of company.
And so the chemicals you have, though, they're not herbal remedies. Like most of these are just like chemicals that are outside of patent, if I'm not mistaken, right? Or they're just like wildly found, like L-theanine, which is in green tea.
Well, no, like I'm looking on the website. Saffron is in there, sage, magnolia bark. There's definitely stuff that's just herbs or natural substance.
They're refined. You go to kind of like the active ingredients. Saffron is something that has a lot of research on its impact on serotonin. There are actual trials of saffron against an antidepressant, which have very interesting results. But essentially, the line between pharma and supplement is a regulatory line. There are different levels of evidence. So for a drug, it needs to go through 3 phases of clinicals. It gets reviewed. It has a much, much higher bar. And it takes $1 billion plus to bring most drugs to market. For supplements, you don't have that bar. So the industry behaves very different. Pharma, you also have single molecule approach, where it's like one molecule that they patent, or they patent time release mechanism on that molecule. For supplements, we take a multi-molecule approach. Let me break down some things that I think are very, very interesting. And it has to do with kind of like this incentive structure. So when you look at prescriber behavior for prescription stimulants, you see a lot of, somebody will go to a physician and say, I'm having trouble focusing. Great. Why don't you try, 10 milligrams of Ritalin? Oh, that's not a good fit. You're feeling too jittery. Let me try you on Adderall. Let's try you on Concerta. And they do this dance of finding the right kind of like fit. It's very similar medications, but like which one is going to be the most effective for this? We found that our second brand, Stasis, is essentially a supplement that is synergistic with a stimulant. So Brian mentioned L-theanine. L-theanine also impacts GABA. It can be synergistic with caffeine. It can also be synergistic with things like an Adderall.
What does it do?
It impacts GABA. So GABA is a neuromodulator. It makes it harder for a neuron to reach its action potential and actually release neurotransmitters into the synapse.
But my understanding of like the L-theanine caffeine duo is that's what's in green tea. So if I just took it in pill form, I'm essentially getting like a stronger green tea.
No. So L-theanine is an amino acid. When L-theanine is combined with caffeine, there's a lot of research that shows it has a non-drowsy calming effect that some people get this anxious feeling. We talked a little bit about the Yerkes-Dodson from the caffeine, that this can mitigate that impact, kind of like flatten out that curve without causing drowsiness. So it's synergistic, and it does that through GABA, which is a neuromodulator.
Gotcha.
And so basically, like the first thing when I looked at some of this research, it's like, okay, like why don't they make Adderall with L-theanine? I mean, they make green tea is caffeine with L-theanine. They make tons of stuff that you can go out there and buy. You can buy pills of caffeine and L-theanine at CVS.
Yeah.
It seems like this would be a great path forward. And what I discovered through talking with a lot of people is it's essentially the incentive structure of pharma is not built for that. So L-theanine is out of patent. It's very difficult, not impossible. It is theoretically possible, and there are examples of this, but it's exceptionally rare to take Adderall, which is out of patent. They have generic Adderall, and combine it with a supplement, which is out of patent, L-theanine, and create a new patent. But to bring that to market as a drug, you would still need to conduct hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research. And so there's no incentive. What company is going to do that when, and there's also the fact that you could just take generic Adderall and buy L-theanine. And so our second product line, Stasis, solves this problem. And it's essentially a different way of looking. It's a multi-molecule approach, which, because of the incentive structure that I just mentioned, we didn't see other companies taking.
Gotcha. So there's no incentive to do multi-molecule, but a lot of them work synergistically together. And you've basically found a lot of those synergies over the years through, the combinations and the selling of that you've done through Thesis.
Essentially, yeah, simplifying it a lot. And where this is important, so like multi-molecule does exist in pharma, but in a different way. So like multi-molecule drugs exist. That's a topic it's not really relevant here, but polypharma is basically, this is kind of like the new epidemic that there's more and more you're seeing in news stories and everything. It's heartbreaking. It's, you start a 5-year-old on Ritalin because they have difficulty focusing. And then, 5 years later, maybe they need an anti-anxiety medication or an antidepressant. And then a couple of years later, maybe they need an Ambien to sleep at night. There was a story in the New York Times. It was just heartbreaking about somebody who was diagnosed with ADHD early, put on a stimulant, and by the time she was 18, she was on antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, ADHD stimulants, Z drugs. It was like this cocktail of medication that if you gave that to me, she ended up in a mental institution. If you gave that to me, I would end up in the same place.
Yeah.
So essentially, one of the goals of Stasis is having another alternative to this polypharma epidemic, where if somebody's taking a stimulant and they're experiencing they want to have better sleep, they don't need to immediately escalate to Ambien, which is a Z drug, and should, in my view, and again, I'm not a doctor, I don't want this to be construed as medical advice, you should almost never have a patient on a prescription amphetamine and a Z drug.
And a Z drug means a sleeping med? What is a Z drug?
It's a class of medication that Ambien belongs to sleep. It's a powerful prescription sleeping medication.
Got it.
It's interesting to hear the sort of cynical side of the pharma empire that I think a lot of us don't
very
really
easy to be.
Yeah, that we just don't think about, that there's so much financial incentive. Yeah.
It's so frustrating because there's so many parts of pharma is crappy and annoying, but with the other side of it is yeah, man, these meds work and that's pretty cool. We're still doing what feels like magic 30 years ago. Yeah.
I mean, pharmacology is, in my view, one of the next phases of human evolution. It's completely transformed the quality of life of just about everyone on the planet, and it's incredible. I think that I know a lot of people that work in pharma, and I advise several companies in the space, and they're good people. I don't think that pharma is evil. I think that it's more like the incentive structure and the way that they have these things for a reason, and they are functioning in a lot of ways, but they're also dysfunctional in others. And it's just acknowledging that.
Well, I mean, it's exactly what you said. When something comes out of patent and now we're no longer focused on improving it because the money's not there, even if we know it's effective, it's just not worth it to us to continue to innovate on it. I get it financially, but that's crazy. That's the reason that we would stop developing it. But so back to your company. So you mentioned the evidence-based approach and the amount of money and research that goes into a single molecule approach from the pharma perspective. What's the evidence-based approach with Thesis? Because I know there's sort of a different standard that you're held to with supplements versus pharmacology. But what kind of evidence do you need to look at? What kind of research have you done in order to say that say the confidence box that you are holding up is actually going to help develop or improve someone's sense of confidence?
So it's evolved over the years. In the very early days, we had not a lot of resources, and the product worked differently, where a consumer would go through, and they were doing this trial and error process of trying a bunch of different ingredients that had some evidence in published trials. There is funding for supplement research through academia. It's just very limited. So if you go to PubMed and you look up saffron, you'll see there are clinicals on saffron. And so that's kind of like where it started. They were willingly opting in. And it was the thought of like, we're going to go through this with you. You tell us what's working and we'll help you get to a blend. That's how it started. And we just amassed this massive data set on what ingredients were working, which ones weren't. And we were constantly optimizing the formulas. Over the years, that data has just grown exponentially. And we use that as kind of like the foundation. What we do, like an example of confidence, which was our last formula that we launched, we do an internal beta test. It is, we do alpha testing, we do beta testing where we'll have multiple arms. Sometimes we'll use a placebo control. We always do at least single blinding, sometimes double blinding. And we just see what are subjective measurements of success. Are people reporting? And the core hypothesis that we had early on is, could we have fewer controls than what you would find in clinical and increase the sample size by orders of magnitude? So clinicals, phase 3 will have a couple hundred patients. What if we had a couple thousand patients, but not as structured? We could never publish this data, but could we create an effective product that people loved? And the answer was yes. Like we use that process, and then we're kind of like backing into clinical. So we're just at the point where it's like, nice. We have products that have great reviews and people love. Can we now take this and pay, because clinicals are very expensive, to go through a clinical on these products and prove in that highly structured environment with all of those controls, it performs as expected.
So when you're saying a published study, you're referring to like a peer-reviewed journal. So obviously we wouldn't find this there, but do you have on your own website, do you have that kind of research documented, or is it more just internal, this is what we've found, so we're selling it this way? I'm just curious. I'm thinking right for people who are interested in learning more about this, are they going to find research?
Right now it's internal. One of the big objectives that I want to do is publish some of it and just be really transparent with like, this is what we did, this is the methods, this is the sample size, here are the results. And I think what's important, we fail internal beta tests all the time. So we've been, we took a crack at creating a better energy formula, and we, made some adjustments to dosages, to ingredients, ran a triple arm trial. It failed. Nothing beat our current formula. We took that knowledge, we reformulated again, same thing. It failed. That was a lot of time and capital that we resourced to that, but we're not going to launch a product unless it hits this really high bar. And just being public about it, like, hey, this is how we make the sausage, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's how we do things.
Well, and also having that reinforcement of the fact that the one that you have is working well, that's not a bad outcome either. It's just too bad that you had to waste the money and resources finding that out when you already had it. I assume part of the reason that the pharma industry is focused on single molecule patents and testing is that it's so much easier than doing it in combination. I can't imagine trying to figure out, is 20 milligrams of this going to work better than 30 milligrams of this when it's combined with these 3 other things? And what if we took away one of those other things? And it just makes the complexity of the testing so much harder. So I can see why they would be focused more on just the individual I'm going to patent this one molecule. We're going to say this thing works. If you want to go and combine it on your own, you do that. But this is our thing. Makes the testing much harder on your end to figure out exactly what's going to be best and what's going to work, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other reasons why they do single molecule, and I completely understand. And I do think it's the structure around how they do clinicals is you can go in and you can dive in, and if you want to take Adderall, you can go through and see every single clinical, and you can see the data, and it's peer reviewed, and you can like really assess what are the side effects. It is, that process has transformed humans. Like it's the backbone of a huge part of modern medicine.
For someone who's looking at thesis and they're looking at the ingredients in some of these things, so for instance, the Clarity formulation includes dihydroxyflavone. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Can they, without, if it were me, I would go and Google that and figure out what that is. But for somebody who's looking at this in general, should they think of all of these as natural ingredients? Are some of these manufactured ingredients? I'm thinking about people who might be fine with taking a supplement or drinking a cup of coffee or something like that if it's natural ingredients, whereas they might not be as comfortable with some of the other ones that are manufactured. Is this a combination of things that are manufactured ingredients, or is dihydroxyflavone something that's derived from a natural source that would be sort of like taking saffron?
So 7-A dihydroxyflavone is a flavonoid. It is found in Tridax daisy. It's a really interesting molecule that can cross the blood-brain barrier and mimics BDNF. I think this is another one where it's like natural versus synthetic. It's not the right thing to be thinking about, and I understand why a lot of people do. One example is caffeine. You have natural forms of caffeine, and then you have synthetic forms of caffeine that are exactly the same. It's the same molecule. You have natural products that will kill you, that are incredibly harmful. And then you have, it doesn't, that level of chemistry, like how do you create it, is a lot less important. All of our ingredients are found in nature, with the exception that for some of them, we alter the molecule so that it's absorbed better. And this is, it just makes sense. There's some molecules found in nature that are very difficult for the human body to absorb, and there's ways that you can chemically alter this so that you get around the problem, and that really benefits the end user.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
There's nothing like Adderall, which is completely synthetic, synthesized, and a drug.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to get at with that question, was whether there was stuff like that or if it's much more natural. And it sounds like it's natural/natural adjusted is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. So listen, Dan, thank you. This was really fascinating to hear about this. Cool. Also just scary to hear about the amount and use of Adderall, and I had no idea that it was becoming such an epidemic. When we were talking about bringing you on, Brian was saying that you had some just fascinating data on that, and I had no idea just how much. I think you said 100,000 pounds of it per year are used, which is, when you think of...
Those pills aren't that big.
Yeah, the size of a pill versus 100,000, that's a lot of pills. So I love the idea of thinking of alternate ways in, and I've had that same, not with Adderall, I've never had direct experience with that, but with other drugs had that same kind of thinking of, does it really have to be between taking an Advil and taking oxycodone or something? Can't there be something in the middle? And it sounds like that could be really helpful for people to see that there's really an alternate path. So thank you again just for joining us and sharing all this information, and we'll put the link to your site and the code in there in case people are interested in trying this out. And thanks for joining Ways We Learn.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
So, folks, thank you for listening, and always keep learning.
Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.